Dawn light on the farmyard. The first grey light arrived without announcement, seeping over the hills east of the farm and spreading slowly across the autumn sky like water through wool. There was no sharp line between night and day, only a gradual thinning of the darkness until the outlines of things became faintly visible. The farmyard lay in a shallow valley in the Bohemian countryside, a patch of packed earth bordered by low stone walls gathered from the fields over many generations. The stones were rounded and dark with moisture, each one fitted against its neighbor without mortar, held by weight and time. In the dimness they seemed almost soft, their edges blurred by the lingering night. A chill hung in the air, the kind of cold that belongs to late October when the ground is not yet frozen but the warmth of summer is long gone. It was a still cold without wind, so the cold settled into every surface evenly. The wooden beams of the barn, the iron hinge of the gate, the thatch of the farmhouse roof, the bare branches of the apple tree by the well, nothing shivered or rattled. The world was simply cool and quiet, wrapped in the hush before sound begins. The barn stood at the northern edge of the yard, its timber frame dark against the lightening sky. Its roof was steep and covered with reed thatch, patched here and there with newer bundles that were still pale gold among the weathered grey. The great double doors faced the yard, closed for the night but not barred, their wooden surface rough with grain and stained by years of rain and sun. Inside the darkness was complete, except for small gaps between the wall planks where thin lines of grey light were beginning to appear. The air within was warmer than outside, thick with the smell of dried grass and the quiet breathing of animals. Near the barn, the goose pen was a simple enclosure of woven hazel hurdles lashed to upright posts. The hurdles were waist-high, their lattice tight enough to keep the birds in, but open enough to let the air pass through. Inside, 12 geese slept in a cluster, their bodies pressed together in a mound of white and grey feathers that rose and fell almost imperceptibly with each shared breath. Their heads were tucked backward and buried under the coverts of their wings, so each bird appeared as a smooth feathered shape without beginning or end, a soft contour blending into the next. The straw beneath them was flattened and warm from their bodies, scattered with small downy feathers that had loosened during the night. The farmhouse sat opposite the barn, its whitewashed walls now a pale, ghostly rectangle in the dawn. Its roof was lower than the barn's, the thatch thicker and more even, and a single chimney rose from its center, cold and silent. The windows were small and shuttered from the inside, so no light escaped and none entered. The door was oak plank, set deep into the wall, and before it lay a flat stone worn smooth by countless footsteps. To one side, a wooden bucket rested upside down on a stool, and a coil of rope hung from a peg. Everything was in order, everything in its proper place, as it had been left the evening before. The sky above the farm was a dome of pale grey, high and featureless, without cloud or colour. Only along the eastern rim, where the hills rose in gentle folds, was there a faint suggestion of something warmer, a barely perceptible shift toward yellow that promised the sun, but had not yet delivered it. The stars had already vanished, the last one winking out only moments before the light began its slow advance. There was no moon, no planet, nothing to mark the heavens except the uniform grey that seemed to press down without weight. As the light grew, the details of the yard began to emerge one by one, as though a patient hand were drawing them into being. The well in the centre of the yard became visible first as a circular shadow, then as a ring of stones with a wooden windlass above it, its rope descending into darkness. Next, the water trough near the goose pen took shape, a hollowed log, black with damp inside. Then the troughing block by the woodshed, its surface scarred and pale. The woodpile stacked neatly against the south wall of the barn, logs of beech and oak in alternating rows. The broom leaning against the farmhouse wall, its birch twigs splayed and worn. The small herb garden by the doorstep, the rosemary and sage now silvered with a fine dew. Each object appeared without fanfare, simply becoming present as the darkness receded. The dew was everywhere, not falling but simply existing, a fine coating on every surface that would catch the light later, but for now only, added a subtle sheen to the world. The stones of the wall glistened faintly. The thatch held droplets along its lower edge. The goose pen hurdles were damp to the touch, the water beading on the smooth hazel bark. Even the packed earth of the yard had a darker, richer colour, where the moisture had settled into the top layer of dust and clay. It was a quiet wetness, the kind that evaporates before mid-morning and leaves no trace. Sound came to the farmyard gradually, arriving in small separate pieces that did not yet form a whole. A rooster crowed somewhere far off, probably at the next farm over the eastern hill, its call thin and distant, more memory than presence. The sound travelled across the fields and arrived already softened, a ghost of itself. After it faded, the silence returned deeper than before, as if the crowing had only served to emphasize how quiet the dawn truly was. Then a small bird in the apple tree made a tentative chirp, a single note that asked a question and received no answer. It tried again, then fell still. The world was not yet ready for birdsong. Nearer at hand, from inside the goose pen, came a low sound that was almost not a sound at all. A soft gurgle from deep in a goose's throat, the noise of a bird stirring in its sleep. One of the white shapes shifted slightly, a wing adjusting without unfolding, and then was still again. The others did not respond, their sleep too deep, their trust in the night's safety too complete. The straw rustled once, a dry whisper, and then nothing more. The light strengthened by almost imperceptible degrees, the grey becoming paler, the shadows less dense. The barn's interior began to reveal itself to itself. The stalls along the back wall where 2 milk cows stood in patient darkness, the loft above where hay was stored, the shelf on the north wall where tools were laid. A single rope hung from a beam, its lower end knotted and swaying slightly, though there was no breeze to move it. Perhaps a mouse had run across the beam above, the tiniest vibration transmitted through the wood. The cows chewed their cud with a slow, rhythmic grinding that was the barn's own heartbeat, steady and eternal. Outside, the well's windlass became distinct enough to see the grain of the wood and the way the rope was wound around it in even coils. The bucket below, invisible from the surface, hung just above the water, its rope straight and taut. The water in the well was black and still, a perfect circle of darkness that reflected nothing but held everything. The memory of rain from springs and summers past, the taste of minerals from the deep rock, the cold that never left it even in the height of summer. A spider had spun a web between the windlass uprights, and the dew had caught in it, making it visible as a silver wheel. The farmhouse chimney remained smokeless, but inside something was beginning to stir. The sound was too faint to hear from the yard, but if one had been inside, one would have heard the creak of a wooden bed frame, the soft pad of bare feet on floorboards, the strike of a flint against steel. These sounds were private, enclosed within the thick walls and shuttered windows, part of the house's own slow waking. They did not yet reach the outside world, which remained under the spell of the grey dawn. The apple tree by the well was old and twisted, its trunk split long ago and healed with a thick scar of bark. Most of its leaves had fallen, though a few still clung to the upper branches, brown and curled, trembling with the memory of wind that was not presently blowing. Small hard apples lay in the grass beneath it, too bitter for eating, left for the wasps and the deer that sometimes came down from the woods at the edge of the fields. The grass itself was long and going to seed, bent over with the weight of dew, a pale tan color that would later in the day catch the sun, but now looked almost grey. Beyond the yard, the fields stretched away in all directions, their boundaries marked by hedgerows of hawthorn and hazel. The fields had been harvested weeks ago, and now they held only stubble and the occasional pumpkin left to ripen on the dying vine. The earth there was darker than the yard, a rich brown loam turned over and resting, preparing itself for the winter frosts that would break down the clods and make the soil ready for spring planting. The hedgerows were still dark, their leaves not yet fully turned, and within them small animals moved unseen, a hedgehog making its slow way home after a night of foraging, a field mouse nibbling a seed held between its paws, a wren flitting from branch to branch in silence. The woods at the far edge of the largest field were a dark line against the sky, mixed oak and beech with a few dark pines standing apart. The trees held their autumn colors muted in the low light, rusts and ochres and deep wine reds that would become brilliant only when the sun touched them. From the yard, the woods looked like a solid wall, no gaps between the trunks, no path visible, but there were paths within, known to the farmer and the woodcutter and the children who sometimes went there for hazelnuts. None of those paths were travelled at this hour. and the woods kept their mystery intact. The light continued its slow transformation, the grey now touched with the faintest hint of amber near the hilltops. The colour was so subtle it might have been imagined, a suggestion rather than a statement. The hills themselves were gentle and rounded, shaped by ancient glaciers and softened further by centuries of ploughing and grazing. Their slopes were patched with fields of different shades, some ploughed dark, some still green with winter wheat, some pale with stubble, making a pattern like a loosely woven cloth spread over the land. Inside the goose pen, one bird finally woke in full. It lifted its head from under its wing with a smooth, careful motion, its neck uncurling like a slow river. The goose blinked, its dark eyes adjusting to the grey light, and looked around the pen with an expression of calm assessment. It saw the other geese still sleeping, the familiar hurdles, the water trough beyond the gate, the barn and the farmhouse and the sky. Nothing had changed during the night. Everything was as it should be. The goose made a soft sound, a low, questioning honk that was barely audible, more of vibration in its throat than a call. Beside it, another goose stirred and lifted its head in response, and for a moment the two birds regarded each other in the quiet fellowship of creatures who have shared a long night and found the morning unchanged. The farmer inside the farmhouse was now fully awake and moving. The sound of a door opening and closing came faintly to the yard, then the clink of a clay cup against a wooden table. Smoke began to curl from the chimney, thin at first, then thicker as the fire caught properly. It rose straight up into the still air, a pale column that spread and vanished into the grey sky, carrying with it the smell of burning beechwood, a clean, sharp scent that mixed with the earth and dew and straw to form the full smell of the morning. The chapter ends as the farmyard waits in the full grey dawn, every object in its place, every creature at peace, the day ahead still unshaped and full of quiet possibility. Nothing has happened yet, and nothing needs to happen, for there is no urgency and no demand. There is only the slow brightening of the sky, the gradual warming of the air, and the steady presence of a world that has woken in this same way for thousands of autumns before, and will do so for thousands more. Inside the farmhouse the darkness was not complete, for the fire had been banked the night before, and a few small coals still glowed behind the ash, giving just enough light to see the shapes of things. The farmer rose from his bed in the corner of the single room, a straw-filled mattress on a wooden frame that had been built by his grandfather. He sat on the edge of it for a moment, his bare feet on the cool floorboards, his hands resting on his knees. The air inside the house was still, and held the warmth of his sleeping, the faint smell of wool and wood smoke and the dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Slowly he stood and moved across the room to the hearth, his steps quiet and practiced on the boards that he knew by heart without needing light. He knelt before the stone fireplace and took the iron poker from its hook, stirring the ash gently until the hidden coals were exposed to the air. They glowed a deep orange, pulsing softly with each small movement of the air. He added a handful of dry straw, watching it curl and catch, then a few thin sticks of beech that had been set aside the night before. The fire woke in silence, its flames small and almost transparent at first, then growing golden and solid as they found their strength. The light spread outward into the room, pushing the shadows back into the corners and making the familiar objects reappear one by one. The heavy oak table, the two wooden chairs, the shelf with its clay pots, the chest that held the family linens. The farmer stood and dressed without hurry, drawing on woolen leggings that had been mended many times at the knee, the stitches small and even where his wife had sewn them. He wore a linen shirt softened by years of washing, its collar frayed but clean, and over it a sleeveless jerkin of brown wool that fastened with wooden toggles. Each movement was simple and complete in itself, the lifting of the leg, the pulling of the fabric, the tying of the cord at the waist. His hands worked without needing his attention, following patterns set down by countless mornings. He walked to the small window and unlatched the shutter, folding it back against the interior wall. The grey dawn light came through the thick, uneven glass in the tiny panes, and now he could see the yard outside, the well, the barn, the goose pen, where the birds were beginning to stir. The light was still pale but gaining strength, and the world outside looked cold and quiet and waiting. He stood there for a long moment, his breath making no mark on the glass, his eyes moving slowly across the scene that was his to care for. breakfast was simple and required no preparation beyond the cutting of bread and the pouring of water. The bread was a dark rye loaf from 2 days before, its crust now hard and its interior still moist enough to chew without soaking. He cut a thick slice with the knife that hung from his belt. The blade curved from years of sharpening and placed it on the bare table. From a covered crock, he took a small piece of hard cheese wrapped in a linen cloth, its edges dry and its color pale gold. He filled a clay cup from the water pail near the door, the water clear and cold and tasting faintly of the stone well it had come from. He ate, standing at the table, not from haste but from habit, his jaw working slowly through the dense bread. Each bite was chewed many times, the flavor of rye and salt and the faint sourness of the old dough filling his mouth. There was no conversation, no inner monologue of plans or worries, only the steady rhythm of eating and the sound of the fire settling behind him. The cat, a grey tabby that lived in the barn and visited the house only for warmth, came to the door and sat on the threshold, its tail wrapped around its paws. It watched the farmer with half-closed eyes, waiting for nothing, asking for nothing. When the bread and cheese were finished, he wiped his hands on a cloth that hung from a peg near the hearth, then splashed a little water from the pail onto his face, rubbing his cheeks and forehead with his wet palms. The cold water tightened his skin and cleared the last sleep from his eyes. He dried his face with the same cloth, then stood for a moment looking at the room in the firelight. Everything was orderly. The bed was still rumpled, but would be straightened later. The hearth was swept. The table was bare except for the bread crock and the knife. The house had the quiet contentment of a place that is well kept. He took his leather apron from its hook behind the door, a heavy piece of cowhide, darkened by years of use, its surface marked with small scratches and stains that told the story of many seasons of work. He slipped the loop over his head and tied the long straps behind his back, the leather settling against his thighs with a familiar weight. The apron was stiff in some places from old grease and soft in others, where his hands had worn it smooth. It smelled of animals and hay and the faint tang of iron from the tools it had protected him against. He opened the farmhouse door and stepped outside, pausing on the flat stone doorstep to let his eyes adjust to the brightness of the open sky. The grey of early dawn had now become a pale silver, the clouds high and thin and moving so slowly they seemed still. The air touched his face with a coolness that was not unpleasant, and he breathed in deeply, the smell of wood smoke from his own chimney mixing with the clean, earthy scent of the yard. The world was silent except for the sound of his own footsteps and the distant caw of a crow somewhere beyond the fields. He walked to the well in the center of the yard, his leather boots making soft impressions in the damp earth. The well was old, its stones green with moss on the shaded side, and its windlass creaked faintly when he touched it. He lifted the wooden cover, setting it aside on the ground, and looked down into the dark circle of water far below. His face was reflected there, a small pale oval in the blackness, and he watched it for a moment without thought. Then he let down the bucket, the rope unwinding smoothly from the windlass with a sound like the turning of pages. The bucket struck the water with a soft hollow splash, filled, and grew heavy on the line. He drew it up hand over hand, the muscles in his forearms working in a steady rhythm, until the bucket emerged into the daylight, water streaming from its sides and dripping back into the well. He carried the bucket to the goose pen and poured some of the water into the trough, the hollowed log that the geese drank from. The water was so clear it was nearly invisible, only the shifting reflections on its surface showing where it lay. The geese noticed his presence now, lifting their heads and making small inquiring sounds, their necks stretching toward him with a gentle curiosity. He spoke a few low words to them, not commands or names, but simply sounds of greeting, his voice low and steady and familiar. The birds stirred in their pen, their feathers rustling, their orange feet shifting on the straw. The yard was now fully visible in the morning light, and the farmer took a moment to look at it as he always did, checking without checking, seeing without looking. The barn doors were still closed, the woodpile was stacked square, the broom was leaning where it always leaned. A few fallen leaves from the apple tree lay scattered on the ground near the well, brown and curled and glistening with the last of the dew. The sky above was a pale even grey, the sun not yet visible but promised by the brightness that gathered behind the eastern hills. The air was cold enough that his breath made faint clouds, but not so cold that he needed gloves, and the clouds of his breath vanished almost as soon as they appeared, dissolving into the morning like small signals of life. He stood there in the center of the yard, the empty bucket still in his hand, his leather apron hanging heavy against his legs, his face turned toward the east where the light was growing. There was nothing urgent to do, nothing calling for his attention except the quiet sequence of the day ahead. The geese settled again behind their hurdles. The cat had returned to its place on the doorstep. The smoke from the chimney rose straight and true into the still air. The farmer took one more deep breath and turned toward the barn, ready to begin the morning's work in the slow and patient way that all work was done here, in this place, in this season, in the autumn of the year 1600. The farmer walked to the barn with the same steady stride he used for every journey across the yard, neither fast nor slow, his boots finding the packed earth that had been trodden by his family for generations. The barn doors faced east and had taken the first light of the morning, their dark wood now showing the deep grain that ran in long vertical lines from top to bottom. He placed both hands on the right door, feeling the rough texture under his palms, and pushed it open along its wooden track. The door moved easily, its weight balanced by years of careful hanging, and made a low rumbling sound that echoed briefly inside the barn before settling into silence. The interior was dim and warm, filled with the breath of animals and the stored heat of the hay. The farmer paused just inside the doorway to let his eyes adjust, the shapes of the barn emerging from the shadows like old friends recognized in a crowd. To the left were the stalls where the two milk cows stood, their large dark bodies motionless except for the slow swing of their tails and the rhythmic working of their jaws. To the right was the hayloft, reached by a lather of split ash poles lashed together with hemp cord, and above it the high roof where swallows nested in summer. Now the nests were empty, small cups of mud that would wait until spring. Straight ahead against the back wall was the workbench, a long slab of beech wood supported on trestles, scarred and stained from 100 different tasks across many seasons. He walked to the workbench and ran his hand along its surface, feeling the places where the wood was smooth from use and the places where it was rough from old cuts. The bench was bare except for a few stray pieces of straw and a small spider web stretched between two of the trestle legs. He brushed the straw to the floor with a gentle sweep of his hand and left the spider web untouched, for it was doing no harm and would catch the small flies that sometimes gathered near the animals. The floor beneath the bench was hard-packed earth, covered with a thin layer of old straw that crackled softly under his boots. Against the wall beside the workbench hung the farmer's tools, each one on its own peg or resting on its own shelf. There was a wooden rake with wide-set teeth for turning hay, a pitchfork with two long iron tines, a hoe with a blade curved like a crescent moon, and a smaller hand sickle for cutting fodder. Below these larger tools was a row of smaller items, a mallet made from a single piece of elm, a draw knife with leather-wrapped handles, a wooden ruler marked with shallow notches, and several coils of hemp twine of different thicknesses. Everything was orderly without being arranged, placed where the hand would naturally reach for it, the logic of work having sorted them over time. The farmer did not need any of these tools today, but he looked at them as he passed, a habit of acknowledgement that kept the barn familiar and safe. He turned instead to a corner near the open doorway, where the light fell in a broad square on the ground. This was the place he had chosen the evening before, where the overhang of the barn roof kept the earth dry and the morning sun would provide good light without glare. Here he would set up the workspace for plucking the goose. He began by bringing out a wooden bench that stood against the inner wall, a simple piece made from a single split log with 4 legs driven into orgered holes. It was not heavy, but it was solid, and he lifted it with one hand under the seat and the other steadying the back, carrying it out under the overhang into the patch of daylight. He set it down carefully so the legs rested evenly on the ground, testing it with a gentle push to be sure it would not wobble. The bench faced slightly toward the east so that the sun, when it rose above the hills, would fall over his shoulder and onto the work in his lap. Next he brought a large wicker basket from inside the barn, woven of willow withies that had been cut from the streamside 2 winters ago. The basket was round and deep, wider at the top than the bottom, with 2 sturdy handles made from thicker withies bent into arches and bound with strips of rawhide. A coarse linen cloth already lined the inside, sewn into place around the rim with a running stitch of thick thread. The cloth was undyed, the color of unbleached wool, and it smelled faintly of the lavender that had been stored in the basket over the summer to keep away moths. He placed the basket to the left of the bench, close enough that he could reach it without stretching, but not so close that it would crowd his legs. Then he brought a smaller tray, flat and rectangular, made from a thin plank of pine wood with raised edges on all four sides. This tray would hold the long-winged quills as they were plucked, keeping them separate from the soft down that would go into the basket. The wood of the tray was pale and clean, almost white, and it had been sanded smooth with dried shark skin to prevent any splinters from catching on the delicate feathers. He set the tray on a small folding stool to the right of the bench, at the same height as his hand when he was seated, so each quill could be laid down without bending or reaching. The farmer returned to the barn and took a whetstone from its shelf, a rectangular block of fine greystone that had been quarried somewhere far away and traded through many hands before arriving in this village. It was dark with old oil and slightly hollow in the center from years of use. He also took a small leather strop and the short knife he would use for cleaning the quills. The knife had a blade no longer than his forefinger, straight-backed and single-edged, with a handle of antler worn smooth and yellow. He sat on the bench and began to sharpen the blade, pouring a little oil from a clay bottle onto the stone and then drawing the knife across it in slow circular motions. The sound of sharpening was soft and regular, a whisper of metal on stone that rose and fell with each stroke. His left hand held the stone steady on his thigh, while his right hand moved the knife in a continuous loop, never lifting the blade from the surface, maintaining the same angle without thought. The oil darkened as it mixed with tiny particles of steel, and the edge of the blade began to gleam in the pale light. He tested the sharpness occasionally against the hair of his forearm, watching a few fine hairs part silently at the touch. When he was satisfied, he wiped the blade clean with a rag and stropped it on the leather with a few firm passes, then set the knife on the tray beside where the quills would later lie. He brought out a bucket from the barn, a sturdy vessel made of oak staves bound with iron hoops, and half filled it with cold water drawn fresh from the well. The bucket was heavy, and he carried it carefully, the water sloshing gently against the sides. He placed it near the bench on the side away from the basket, and dropped a clean rag of linen into it, the cloth sinking slowly and spreading under the surface like a pale water plant. This water would be for washing his hands and for cleaning any small amount of blood from the plucking, though a careful plucking drew little to none. The farmer surveyed his arrangement with a slow, considering gaze, adjusting the position of the basket by a hand spane and moving the bucket slightly back so it would not be kicked. The bench was set, the basket lined and waiting, the tray empty and clean, the knife sharp and placed just so, the water cool and ready. The workspace was complete, a small outdoor room defined by the reach of his arms, containing everything needed and nothing extra. It had the settled look of something that had grown there naturally, though it was the result of deliberate and experienced care. The light had continued to change while he worked, the grey of early morning now giving way to a pale gold that touched the top of the barn roof and the highest branches of the apple tree. The sun itself was still hidden behind the hills, but its approach was now certain, the sky above the eastern ridge brightening to a soft yellow-white. The air remained cold, but the promise of warmth was in it, a thin layer of comfort that would thicken as the morning progressed. A few small clouds had appeared high up, scattered like grain across the blue-grey expanse, moving slowly from north to south without blocking the light. Birds had begun to sing in the hedgerows, not loudly, but with the quiet persistence of the season. A blackbird somewhere in the hawthorn gave its low fluting call, and a sparrow chirped twice from the thatch of the farmhouse roof. The sounds came and went without pattern, filling the air briefly before leaving it empty again. From inside the barn the cows shifted their weight, a hoof thudding softly on the packed earth, and the sound carried into the yard like a single low note of contentment. The farmer took a moment now to simply sit on the bench, his hands resting on his apron, his back straight but not stiff. He looked toward the goose pen where the birds were fully awake, their white shapes moving against the brown of the hurdles, their heads raised and their eyes bright in the growing light. They knew him, and he knew them, each bird an individual recognized by the shape of its bill and the pattern of its walk. The gander he would pluck today was among them, a large bird with a particularly full breast and long, clean wing feathers, now dipping its head into the water trough, and lifting it again to let the water run down its throat in a smooth swallowing motion. The farmhouse chimney still sent up a thin column of smoke, and now a second figure appeared in the doorway, the farmer's wife, who carried a small basket of mending under her arm and sat on the doorstep with the grey cat curling around her ankles. She did not call out or disturb the quiet, settling herself to work with the same calm economy of movement her husband had shown. The two of them, man and wife, existed in the same yard without needing to speak, their morning routines fitting together like the stones of the wall. The farmer stood again and made a final small adjustment to his workspace, moving the folding stool that held the quill tray a thumb's width to the right, so that the shadow of the barn would not fall across it as the sun rose higher. Then he walked back into the barn and emerged with a small armful of clean straw, which he scattered in a loose layer under and around the bench to catch any stray feathers that might drift down during the plucking. The straw was dry and golden and rustled crisply as it fell, settling into a soft mat that would make the final sweeping easier. Now everything was ready. The bench waited under the overhang, the basket yawned open with its coarse cloth, the tray lay empty for the quills, the knife gleamed with its fresh edge, the water bucket stood cool and still. The farmer stood beside his creation, this small island of purpose in the quiet sea of the farmyard, and felt the deep satisfaction of rightness without hurry. He did not name the feeling or examine it. He simply inhabited it, the way a stone inhabits its place in a wall. The morning was still young, the geese were calm, and the work ahead would unfold in its own time, as all work did here, in the slow and steady manner of the world before machines and clocks, and the anxious need to fill each moment with noise. The farmer walked across the yard toward the goose pen, his boots making soft crunching sounds on the scattered straw and the packed earth that was now beginning to dry in the strengthening light. The sun had still not fully cleared the eastern hills, but its glow was spilling over the ridges and filling the farmyard with a gentle amber warmth that touched everything equally. The grey stones of the well, the silver thatch of the barn roof, the dark water in the trough, the white feathers of the geese. The air had lost its sharp edge, and now felt merely cool, like the inside of a stone dairy on a summer afternoon. The goose pen stood where it had always stood, a rectangle of woven hurdles lashed to chestnut posts that had been driven into the earth so long ago that the wood at their bases was dark and soft with age. The hurdles were made of hazel rods split lengthwise and woven in and out of 3 horizontal rails, creating a lattice of diamond-shaped gaps just wide enough for a goose to push its bill through, but not its head. The tops of the hurdles were uneven, the rods having been cut at different lengths, and over the years the rain had smoothed their ends to rounded points that caught the light like rows of small, pale knuckles. A gate of similar construction hung from leather hinges at the corner nearest the water trough, secured by a loop of hemp cord slipped over an upright post. The farmer approached the pen with the same calm he brought to all his tasks, his breathing even, and his shoulders relaxed under the leather apron. The geese saw him coming, their dark eyes tracking his movement across the yard, and a low murmuring passed among them, a shared sound that was not alarm but acknowledgment. They knew this man and his steady tread, his familiar shape and smell, the way his hands moved when he came among them. A goose's memory is long, and these geese had been raised from downy goslings in this very pen, fed from this same hand, spoken to in this same low voice, since the first day they had been carried home from the village market wrapped in a warm cloth. 12 geese lived in the pen, a number that had remained constant for many years because the farmer kept a careful balance, allowing the old birds to live out their natural span, while each spring a few new goslings were raised to replace those that had grown too old or been taken for the table. The flock was a mixture of ages and sizes, some as young as 7 months, with feathers still tight and sleek, others as old as 7 years, with the substantial weight and the wise, measuring gaze of birds who had seen many seasons come and go. Their colours ranged from pure white to a soft grey that showed faint barring on the wings and a pale smudge on the rump, and their bills were a uniform orange, bright as carrot, with a small hard knob at the base where the bill met the feathered forehead. As the farmer reached the gate, the geese nearest to it stepped back a pace or two, not in fear but in courtesy, making room. They moved with the rolling waddle of their kind, their bodies tilting from side to side, their large webbed feet lifting and planting with a deliberate slowness that matched the farmer's own. The straw beneath them rustled and settled, releasing a dry, dusty scent that mingled with the clean animal smell of warm feathers and the faint ammonia of their droppings, which were regularly mucked out and spread on the vegetable garden to enrich the soil. He lifted the cord from the post, the hemp smooth and stiff under his fingers, and let the gate swing inward on its leather hinges with a soft creaking sound. The leather was old and dark, cut from a cow's hide many years ago, and it had stretched just enough that the gate hung slightly low, brushing the ground as it opened. The farmer stepped through the opening and into the pen, his boots sinking a little into the deep straw that covered the ground. Straw that was clean and pale on top, and darker, more broken, underneath where it had been trodden and turned. The geese parted around his legs like water dividing around a stone, a natural flowing movement that seemed rehearsed but was simply instinct. They did not scatter or flap, they simply adjusted their positions, each bird finding a new spot to stand where it was not in the man's way, and then they settled again, their necks turning to keep their eyes on him with a quiet curiosity. One young goose, a grey feathered bird with an especially long neck, stretched its head toward the farmer's hand and made a soft peeping sound. Not the full honk of an adult, but the smaller, gentler noise of a bird still finding its voice. The farmer looked down at it and made a low sound in return, something between a hum and a murmur, and the young goose seemed satisfied, drawing its head back and tucking it slightly. He stood in the center of the pen for a moment, letting the birds grow accustomed to his presence inside their space. He looked at each one in turn, his gaze moving slowly from goose to goose, not as a predator sizes up prey, but as a craftsman assesses material, with knowledge and respect and a clear sense of what was needed. The birds looked back at him, their black eyes unblinking, their heads tilted at small angles that gave them an air of permanent, gentle question. The bird he sought was a mature gander, the largest in the flock, a bird of 5 years, with a breast as round and full as a pillow and wings that stretched wide when he spread them in the sun. The farmer knew this gander well, had watched him grow from a gosling of particularly bold character who would follow the farmer's boots around the yard and peck at the leather laces. Now he was the undisputed leader of the flock, the first to the trough when fresh water was poured, the first to sound an alarm if a fox was scented on the night air, the first to settle when the danger passed. His name, insofar as a goose could have a name, was a particular low whistle that the farmer made only for him, 2 notes descending, and when the farmer made that sound now, the gander lifted his head and looked directly at the man. This gander was a splendid bird, his plumage mostly white, with a faint creamy tinge on the breast where the down was thickest, and his wings held long flight feathers of a pure pale grey at the tips that faded to white near the shafts. His neck was thick and strong, arched in a confident curve, and his head was large with a high crown. The orange of his bill was deeper than the others, almost a reddish orange, and the knob at its base was prominent and hard. His eyes were set high on the sides of his head, giving him a wide field of vision, and they were dark and bright and full of an intelligence that was not human but was no less real for that. The farmer took a step toward the gander, and the other birds moved aside a little more to give him room. The gander did not retreat, but stood his ground, his head held high, his throat feathers slightly ruffled. The farmer spoke to him in a quiet voice, a stream of soft syllables that had no meaning except comfort, the sound of safety and familiarity. He said something about the morning, about the sun, about the good straw underfoot, and the gander listened with the attentive stillness of an animal that trusts completely. The other geese also listened, their heads turning slightly, and then they went back to their own small occupations, preening a wing covert, nibbling at a piece of straw, dipping a bill into the water trough. Now the farmer lowered himself slowly, bending at the knees, keeping his movements smooth and unhurried, so that no shadow of suddenness would alarm the bird. He reached out his left hand and placed it gently against the gander's breast, feeling the warmth of the body through the thick layer of feathers and down, the steady beat of the small heart, the firm curve of the keel bone beneath. The gander stood perfectly still under this touch, his dark eye watching the farmer's face. Then the farmer brought his right hand around to the bird's back, his fingers spreading wide to support the wings and the weight of the body, and with a single fluid motion he lifted the gander from the straw. The lifting was gentle and sure, the bird's body fitting naturally against the farmer's chest and arm, the way a cat might be held, or a sleeping child. The gander weighed perhaps 15 pounds, solid and warm, and the farmer adjusted his grip slightly, so the bird's breast rested along his forearm, and the long neck curved back toward the farmer's shoulder. The gander's orange feet dangled just above the ground. The webs folded slightly, and he made no struggle at all. Only a small adjustment of his wings under the farmer's palm as he settled into the carry. The other geese watched this removal of their leader with what might have been mild curiosity, or might have been no particular interest at all. One of the older females, a white goose with a speckled patch on her crown, came forward and sniffed at the farmer's boot, her bill making a soft tapping sound against the leather. Then she turned away and resumed her slow pacing around the pen, her feet lifting and falling with the same deliberate rhythm as before. The flock was calm, their confidence unshaken, for they had seen this ritual many times and understood that the gander would return later, perhaps a little lighter in feather, but otherwise himself. The farmer backed out of the pen with the gander held securely against him, stepping carefully over the low threshold of the gate to avoid jostling his burden. Once he was outside, he set the bird down for a moment on the ground at his feet, keeping one hand lightly on the gander's back to reassure him. The gander stood quietly, his head turning to take in the familiar yard from this slightly altered height, his orange feet planted solidly on the packed earth. He ruffled his feathers once, a full body shake that ran from his bill to his tail in a rippling wave, and then settled into stillness again, his plumage smooth and glossy in the morning light. The farmer closed the gate of the pen, lifting it slightly to compensate for the stretched hinge and settling the loop of cord back over the post. He gave it a small tug to be sure it was secure, then turned his attention back to the gander. The bird looked up at him, and the farmer made the two-note whistle again, softer this time, a private sound between the two of them. Then he bent and lifted the gander once more, cradling the bird against his body, and began the short walk back to the bench under the overhang of the barn roof. The yard had changed subtly while he had been in the pen. The sun had now cleared the hills, and a flood of pale golden light poured across the farm, transforming the grey of the early morning into a world of colour and shadow. The barn roof glowed warmly, each reed of the thatch catching the light on its upper edge and casting a thin shadow below. The apple tree cast a long blue shadow across the grass, its bare branches tracing a pattern like a map of rivers on the ground. The well stones looked drier now, their moss less vivid, but their edges sharper. Even the pail of water outside the farmhouse door reflected a bright coin of sunlight that moved slightly with the slow stirring of the water. The farmer's wife had gone back inside, the doorstep now empty except for the grey cat, which had curled into a tight circle with its tail wrapped over its nose and its eyes closed. A few hens from the small coop behind the farmhouse had ventured out into the yard, scratching at the earth near the woodpile with their strong yellow feet, making the soft clucking sounds that hens make when they are content. They paid no attention to the farmer and his goose, for a goose was not a hen and held no interest for them. The farmer reached the bench and stood beside it, the gander still calm in his arms. He lowered himself onto the bench, feeling the smooth wood through his leggings, and arranged the gander across his lap, with the bird's body resting along his thighs and its head facing toward his knees. He placed his left hand lightly on the gander's back, just above the base of the wings, and with his right hand he gently stroked the bird's neck, running his fingers along the smooth curve from head to shoulders in a slow, repeated motion that was as much for his own calm as for the bird's. The gander closed his inner eyelids, the pale, translucent membranes sliding across his dark eyes from front to back, and his breathing became deep and even. The farmer let the moment stretch, not rushing toward the work. He looked at the bird's wing, where the long flight feathers lay folded in an orderly, overlapping pattern. The primary feathers, the longest and stiffest, the secondaries slightly shorter and softer. He could see the quill ends, the hollow shafts where they emerged from the skin, each one surrounded by a tiny circle of soft down. The wing feathers were beautifully formed, nature's own design for lifting a heavy body into the air, though this gander had never flown more than a few feet off the ground, preferring the solid earth of the farmyard to the uncertain sky. The feathers were clean and well oiled from the bird's preening, their surfaces smooth and slightly glossy, their edges aligned with precise geometry. The sun touched the farmer's shoulder now, warming the brown wool of his jerkin and the leather of his apron. A very small breeze had started up, barely enough to stir the loose straw on the ground, and it carried a scent of wood smoke and drying leaves from somewhere beyond the farm. The morning was truly underway, and the world was awake, but here, under the overhang, there was only the quiet rhythm of breathing, man and bird together, sharing a moment that needed no words and left no mark except the slow building of trust that made the work possible. The farmer sat on the bench with the gander resting across his lap, the bird's body warm and still against his thighs. He had positioned himself so the morning sun fell over his left shoulder, illuminating the bird's wing without casting his own shadow across the feathers. The light was now a clean, pale gold, strong enough to reveal every detail of the plumage, but still soft, still gentle, the light of a sun that had not yet climbed to its full height. The air under the overhang was motionless, sheltered from the small breeze that stirred the yard beyond, and it held the quiet sense of old wood and clean straw and the faint animal warmth of the goose. He began with the left wing, because the left wing produced the best quills for a right-handed scribe, the natural curve of the feather shaft fitting comfortably against the writer's hand when the quill was trimmed and shaped. This was a piece of knowledge so old that no one remembered who had first discovered it, passed down through generations of farmers and scribes and monks in scriptoria, a small piece of practical wisdom that had travelled across Europe and arrived in this Bohemian farmyard as surely as the seed of a useful plant. The farmer placed his left hand flat on the gander's back, the pressure light but constant, a reminder of presence. Then he took the bird's wing in his right hand, his fingers circling the joint where the wing met the body, feeling the hard knob of bone beneath the skin and feathers. The gander allowed this without resistance, its inner eyelids still closed, its breathing slow and deep. The farmer unfolded the wing slowly, extending it outward from the body, and the long flight feathers spread like the sticks of a fan, each one separating from its neighbor to reveal its full length for the first time. There were 10 primary feathers on the wing, the outermost pinions that gave the bird its strongest lift, and each one was a marvel of natural engineering. The shafts were hollow and round, pale white at the base where they entered the skin and becoming darker toward the tip, ending in a translucent quill end that had once been filled with blood during the feather's growth, but was now empty and clean. The veins on either side of the shaft were made of thousands of tiny barbs that locked together in perfect alignment, creating a smooth, continuous surface that was stiff enough to push against the air and flexible enough to bend without breaking. The feathers were colored in soft grays and whites, the outermost primary the darkest, each successive feather slightly lighter until the innermost ones were almost pure white. The farmer studied the wing for a moment, his eyes moving along the line of feathers from the tip of the wing to the body. He was checking for any feathers that might be damaged or still growing, for a growing feather had a dark quill filled with blood and could not be plucked without causing harm. But all the feathers were mature, their quills clear and empty, the bases slightly dry where they emerged from the skin. The gander had finished its molt many weeks ago, and these feathers were firmly set in their follicles but ready to release when the time came. He selected the first feather, the longest and outermost primary, and took its quill between his right thumb and forefinger, gripping it as close to the skin as possible. The quill was smooth and cool, slightly flattened on its underside, and he could feel the tiny ridge where the feather emerged from the follicle. He held the wing steady with his other fingers, his left hand still resting on the bird's back, and then with a single smooth motion he pulled the feather free. There was a soft sound, a tiny dull pop as the hollow shaft released its hold on the skin, and the feather came away cleanly in his hand. The gander did not flinch or startle, merely blinked once with its inner eyelids, and then settled again, its trust in the farmer's hands absolute. A tiny bead of clear fluid appeared at the empty follicle, smaller than a pinhead, and the farmer touched it gently with the tip of his finger, feeling the faint moisture that was the only sign the feather had been removed. He held the feather up to the light for a moment, turning it so he could inspect the full length of the quill. The calamus, the bare hollow portion at the base, was about 4 fingers long and perfectly round, its walls thick enough to be strong, but thin enough to be easily cut and shaped. The shaft above the veins was straight and true, without any kinks or bends that would make it unsuitable for a writing quill. The vane itself was unbroken, the barbs locked together in their smooth, continuous surface, the color a soft, warm gray that would later be stripped away or left as the scribe preferred. He laid the feather carefully on the small pine tray to his right, placing it so the quill end pointed toward the barn and the tip pointed toward the yard, an orientation that would let him lay each successive feather beside it without tangling the veins. The feather rested on the pale wood with a slight curl, the tip lifting just a little from the surface, and it caught the sunlight along its length, so that the grey showed silver and the white showed cream. The farmer returned his attention to the wing and took hold of the second primary feather, the one next to the first. This feather was nearly as long as the outermost one, but slightly broader in the vein, its color a shade lighter, and its quill was marginally thicker at the base. He gripped it in the same way, thumb and forefinger close to the skin, and pulled with the same smooth motion. The soft pop came again, and the feather came free, its quill end glistening with the same tiny bead of moisture. He inspected it briefly, found it good, and laid it beside the first feather on the tray, aligning the quill ends so they formed an even row. The third feather was lighter still, its veins showing more white than grey, and its shaft had a slightly different curve, a gentle bowing that would make it suitable for a different style of writing than the straighter feathers. He removed it with the same care and set it in its place, the row on the tray growing slowly, feather by feather, each one finding its position as naturally as the geese had found their places in the pen. The farmer worked in a steady rhythm now, his movements falling into a pattern that required no thought, his hands knowing what to do without his mind having to direct them. Grip the quill close to the skin, pull with an even pressure, inspect the shaft, lays on the tray in the growing row. Between each feather, he paused a moment to let the bird rest, stroking the gander's neck with one finger, feeling the smooth feathers and the warm skin beneath. The gander remained calm throughout, its eyes closed, its body soft and heavy against the farmer's lap, the rise and fall of its breathing as steady as a tide. The fourth primary was slightly shorter, the fifth shorter still, the sixth and seventh marking the transition from the long, stiff primaries to the broader, more flexible secondaries. By the time he reached the eighth feather, the veins were wider and softer, less suited for writing quills, but still useful for other purposes, and the quills themselves were thinner-walled and more translucent. He plucked these too, because they could be bundled with the better quills and sold to those who needed a cheaper writing instrument or a softer quill for delicate work. Each feather was laid on the tray in its order, creating a graduated display from the longest and darkest to the shortest and palest. The gander stirred slightly when the farmer shifted the wing to reach the innermost feathers, making a small adjustment of its head, tucking its bill a little deeper against its breast. The farmer paused and waited until the bird settled again, then continued with the ninth and 10th primaries, the smallest of the flight feathers, which came away easily with a gentle tug. Now the left wing was bare of its long feathers, showing only the fluffy coverts that would remain to protect the wing from the cold until the new feathers grew in the spring. He turned his attention to the right wing, unfolding it with the same gentle care, spreading the flight feathers in their fan. The process repeated exactly: grip, pull, inspect, lay on the tray. The right wing's feathers were mirror images of the left, their curves reversed, and he laid them on the tray facing the opposite direction so that the two rows of feathers formed a symmetrical pattern, like the ribs of a leaf arranged on either side of a central stem. The tray now held 20 feathers in all, a pale fan of quills that glowed in the morning light, their shafts translucent and their veins overlapping in soft greys and creams. The farmer lifted the tray and looked at the feathers as a group, checking for any that might have been damaged during plucking. All were whole, their quills unbroken, their veins smooth. He nodded slightly to himself, a barely perceptible movement that was as much expression of satisfaction as he allowed himself during work, and set the tray back on the stool, moving it slightly further from the bench so it would not be knocked by an accidental movement. Now he took a moment to rest his hands, placing them palm down on the gander's warm back and feeling the bird's heart beat through the feathers, a quick, soft pulse that was faster than his own, but steady and untroubled. He looked out across the yard while his hands rested, his gaze moving slowly over the familiar scene. The hens were still scratching near the woodpile, making small sounds of contentment. The cat had shifted position on the doorstep and was now lying on its side in a patch of sun, its belly exposed to the warmth. The smoke from the farmhouse chimney had thinned to a faint wisp, and the smell of baking bread was beginning to drift across the yard. The first indication that the farmer's wife had started the day's baking. The plucking of the flight feathers was complete. What remained on the goose was the thick undercoat of soft down, which would come next. But for now, there was only this quiet interval between one task and another. The farmer sat without moving, the gander resting across his lap, the tray of quills gleaming on the stool beside him, the morning sun warming the side of his face. Time did not press. There was no schedule to keep, no deadline to meet, only the natural rhythm of the work unfolding at its own pace in the quiet farmyard. The tray of wing quills sat on the stool in 2 neat rows, and the farmer turned his attention now to the soft underfeathers that lay hidden beneath the goose's outer plumage. He shifted slightly on the bench, adjusting the gander's weight across his lap so the bird's breast was fully exposed to the morning light, and then he paused for a moment with both hands resting lightly on the warm feathered body, feeling the steady rise and fall of the bird's breathing. The work of plucking the flight feathers had been a matter of firm grips and gentle pulls, but the gathering of down would require a different touch entirely, lighter and more delicate, the fingers working like a comb through the softer parts of the bird. The gander's outer feathers, the smooth, overlapping plumage that gave the bird its shape and kept it dry in wet weather, were still in place, and beneath them lay the down, a hidden layer of tiny fluffy feathers that grew close to the skin. Each down feather was a small miracle of softness, with a short central shaft no thicker than a hair in a cloud of branching barbs that did not lock together like the flight feathers, but remained separate, creating a light, airy mass that trapped warmth against the bird's body. The down was palest grey, almost white in the deepest layers, and it had a silvery sheen where the light caught it, like frost on a still morning. The farmer began with the breast, where the down was thickest and most abundant. He used his left hand to gently lift the outer feathers, parting them like a curtain, and then with the thumb and forefinger of his right hand he reached into the warm space beneath. His fingers found the down immediately, a yielding softness that seemed to give way before he even touched it, and he closed them gently around a small tuft, feeling the fibers compress under the lightest pressure. He did not pull sharply as he had with the wing quills, but instead used a gentle pinching and lifting motion that coaxed the down away from the skin without any sudden movement. The first tuft came free with a barely audible whisper, a sound so faint it was more like the idea of a sound than the sound itself. It rested between his fingers, a small cloud of grey-white fluff that weighed almost nothing, and when he opened his hand slightly, the down seemed to expand, the individual barbs separating and reaching outward as if they were still alive. A few of the finest fibers broke free and drifted upward on the still air, catching the sunlight and floating like tiny pale moths before settling gently on the farmer's leather apron. He cupped his hand and carried the tuft to the wicker basket, where he let it fall onto the coarse linen cloth that lined the inside. The down landed without a sound, nestling against the fabric, its fibers already beginning to mingle with the weave in a way that would later make it easy to gather and clean. He reached back to the gander's breast, parting the outer feathers again, his fingers finding the warm pocket of down that seemed to replenish itself as he worked, each removal revealing another layer beneath, as if the bird held an endless supply of softness. The process settled into a slow rhythm that was different from the plucking of the quills, less mechanical and more like the patient work of carding wool or picking seeds from a cotton ball. Pinch and lift, cup and carry, release into the basket. Between each movement, the farmer paused to check the bird's comfort, his left hand stroking the gander's neck or resting lightly on the back, his eyes watching the dark eye of the goose for any sign of discomfort. But the gander remained perfectly calm, its breathing deep and regular, the inner eyelids still closed over its dark eyes, its body a warm relaxed weight against the farmer's thighs. The down varied slightly in character depending on where it grew. The breast down was the finest and most abundant, with the longest fibers and the greatest loft, the kind of down that would later fill the center of a pillow and give it that soft yielding quality that made a sleeper's head sink into comfort. Further down the body, toward the belly, the down was slightly coarser, with a few small feathers mixed in, and the farmer separated these as he worked, letting the coarser bits fall to the straw beneath the bench, where they would later be swept up and used for less precious fillings. His fingers learned to distinguish the different textures by touch alone. The fine down almost liquid in its softness, the coarser fibers more springy and resistant. The basket slowly began to fill, the first layer of down spreading across the linen cloth like a shallow snowfall, white and grey and silver in the shifting light. The farmer paused occasionally to press the down gently with his palm, compressing the loose fibers so they would not billow up and drift away. And each time he did this, the down made a soft rustling sound, the sound of thousands of tiny filaments sliding against each other, a dry whisper that seemed too quiet to be heard and yet was perfectly audible in the stillness of the farmyard. The morning sun had climbed higher while he worked, and the patch of light that fell across his shoulder had shifted, moving down his arm and onto the gander's back. The bird's outer feathers gleamed where the light touched them, each smooth vein reflecting a pale sheen, and the farmer could see the individual barbs of the remaining plumage, the tiny hooks that held them together, the way they overlapped like the tiles on a well-made roof. The air had warmed slightly, enough that the farmer's hands no longer felt the chill of the early dawn, and the smells of the farmyard had intensified. The dry straw, the clean earth, the distant bread baking, the faint animal scent of the goose itself, which was not unpleasant, but simply the smell of a living creature, warm feathers and clean skin, and the slightly oily secretion that kept the outer plumage waterproof. He moved from the breast to the sides of the bird, working his fingers under the wings where the down was thick but harder to reach. Here he had to be especially careful, for the skin was looser and more delicate, and the gander might flinch if he pulled too firmly. He used only the very tips of his fingers, taking the smallest pinches, coaxing the down away with a lightness of touch that came from years of practice and a deep familiarity with the bodies of geese. The down in these hidden places was especially clean, never having been exposed to the dust of the yard or the water of the trough, and it was so white it seemed to glow in the sunlight, the fibers so fine they were almost invisible individually, only visible as a collective cloud. The farmer's wife came out of the farmhouse once, crossing the yard with a bucket of scraps for the hens, and she glanced over at the bench under the overhang as she passed. She saw her husband bent over the gander, his hands moving with the slow rhythm of the work, the basket beside him half filled with down, the tray of quills gleaming on the stool. She did not speak, for there was nothing to say, and she continued on her way to the hen coop, the grey cat rising from the doorstep to follow her, with its tail held high. The hens rushed toward her when she scattered the scraps, their clucking rising to a brief crescendo and then falling again as they pecked at the bits of bread and vegetable peel. The farmer paid no attention to this small commotion, his focus entirely on the bird in his lap. He had reached the lower belly now, where the down was thinner and mixed with the small soft feathers that covered the bird's underside. Here he worked even more slowly, taking only the finest fibers and leaving the slightly coarser ones in place, for the bird needed some protection from the cold even in the mild autumn weather. The down he gathered from this area was the warmest of all, for it had lain closest to the bird's skin and held the heat of its body, and when he placed it in the basket it seemed to release that warmth into the air, a faint breath of animal heat that rose and dissipated. The pile in the basket grew gradually, handful by handful, pinch by pinch, the loose mass of down rising like dough in a warm kitchen. The farmer paused now and then to wash his hands in the bucket of cool water, dipping his fingers and rubbing them together to remove the tiny fibers that clung to his skin, for the down had a way of sticking to everything, drawn by static and by the natural oils of his hands. The water in the bucket developed a faint haze of floating fibers, a pale cloud just beneath the surface that moved with the currents of his movements, and when he dried his hands on the linen rag, he left small traces of down on the cloth, which he shook out over the basket so nothing was wasted. The gander stirred once during the process, perhaps feeling a slight discomfort as the farmer worked around the sensitive area where the wings joined the body, and it lifted its head briefly, its dark eyes opening and fixing on the farmer's face with a look of calm inquiry. The farmer stopped immediately, his hands going still, and he made the low two-note whistle, soft and reassuring. The gander held its head up for a moment longer, its throat moving as it swallowed once, and then it tucked its bill back into the feathers of its breast and closed its eyes again. The farmer waited until he felt the bird's body relax fully before he resumed his work, his fingers moving even more gently than before. The sun continued its slow arc across the sky, and the shadows under the overhang began to lengthen slightly, the sharp edge of the barn roof shadow creeping outward across the packed earth. The farmer's back was warm now from the sun, and he could feel the heat soaking through his woolen jerkin and into his skin. A pleasant sensation that eased the slight stiffness of sitting in one position for a long while. He rolled his shoulders once, a small movement that did not disturb the bird, and then continued the work, his hands moving with the same patient rhythm they had established at the start. The down from the gander's back came next, a broad area of thick, fluffy feathers that the bird used to insulate itself against the coldest weather. Here the farmer could take larger pinches, for the down was dense and came away easily, the fibers clumping together in his fingers and holding their shape until he placed them in the basket. The color of this down was a slightly darker gray, like the gray of a winter sky just before snow, and it had a springiness that the breast down lacked, a resilience that would make it especially good for filling the edges of a pillow where firmness was needed. He moved around the gander's body in a methodical way, covering every area in turn, leaving no patch of thick down ungathered, but always leaving enough behind that the bird would not feel the cold when it returned to the pen. The work was like harvesting a field where only the ripest grain is taken, leaving the rest to stand and protect the soil. The farmer understood this balance instinctively, taking what was needed and leaving what was necessary, a principle that governed all the work of the farm, from the cutting of hay to the collection of eggs. The wicker basket was now more than half full, the down piled in a soft mound that rose above the rim and quivered slightly with every movement of the air. The farmer pressed it down again with his palm, compacting the mass so it would hold more, and the down resisted slightly before yielding, its fibers compressing and then slowly expanding again when the pressure was removed. The basket held the warm, clean smell of the bird, a smell that was not strong but distinct, like clean wool or the fur of a healthy cat. And this smell would linger in the down even after washing, giving the finished pillows and coverlets a faint, comforting scent that would be associated forever with sleep and warmth and safety. The farmer took one final pinch of down from the gander's throat, a delicate area where the feathers were short and the down was fine as silk, and then he sat back slightly on the bench, his hands coming to rest on the bird's back. He surveyed his work, looking at the gander's plumage where small gaps now showed between the outer feathers, invisible unless one looked closely, the bird's outline unchanged, but its insulation slightly thinned. The goose looked exactly as it had before, calm and dignified, its eyes closed, its breast rising and falling with the same slow rhythm. It had given up a basketful of its softness and seemed not to have noticed at all. The farmer washed his hands in the bucket of water again, this time more thoroughly, rubbing his palms and the backs of his hands and the spaces between his fingers until all the clinging down was gone. He dried his hands on the linen rag, shook the rag over the basket, and then stood from the bench, lifting the gander carefully in both arms. The bird's head came up at the movement, and it looked around the yard with its dark, intelligent eyes, taking in the changed angle of the light and the longer shadows and the thin curl of smoke from the farmhouse chimney. The basket of down sat on the ground beside the bench, its contents full and soft and gleaming in the morning light, a harvest of warmth gathered without haste, without harm, in the quiet way that all harvests were gathered on this farm. The work was not yet finished, for the down would need to be washed and dried and the quills cleaned and sorted, but the gathering was done, and the farmer stood for a moment in the patch of sun, the gander held against his chest, feeling the simple satisfaction of a task completed with care. The gander had been returned to the pen, carried back across the yard with the same gentle care the farmer had used when he brought it out. The bird rejoined the flock without ceremony, stepping from the farmer's arms onto the deep straw and waddling immediately toward the water trough, where it drank in long, slow sips, its throat moving rhythmically as the water went down. The other geese gathered around it briefly, their heads bobbing in what might have been greeting or might have been greeting simple curiosity about the slightly thinned plumage, and then they dispersed back to their own quiet occupations, the flock settling into its familiar pattern as though the gander had never been away. Now the farmer sat on the bench under the overhang with the tray of wing quills on the stool beside him and the bucket of water at his feet, which he had refreshed with a new dipperful from the well, so the water was cool and clean. The quills lay in their 2 neat rows, 20 feathers from the left and right wings arranged by length, their shafts pale and translucent in the morning light, their veins smooth and overlapping at the edges. They had dried slightly since being plucked, the tiny beads of moisture at the quill ends now gone, and the hollow shafts were beginning to harden in the air, becoming stiffer and more brittle, which was exactly what was needed before the cleaning could begin. He took the small knife from the tray, the one with the antler handle worn smooth and yellow, and tested its edge against his thumb, feeling the fine bite of the steel. It was still sharp from the morning's honing, the edge straight and true, and he set it on his thigh while he reached for the first quill, the longest primary from the left wing. He held the feather by its shaft near the middle, where the bare quill gave way to the vein, and he turned it so the base was angled toward the light, letting him see the full length of the calamus. The base of the quill still carried a small ring of dried tissue where it had been attached to the bird's skin, a translucent fringe no larger than a fingernail clipping. This needed to come away, along with any trace of the follicle that still clung to the hollow interior of the shaft. He brought the knife to the quill, not cutting but scraping. The blade held almost flat against the shaft and drawn downward from the base toward the tip of the bare calamus in a single smooth stroke. The dried tissue peeled away in a tiny curl, pale and papery, and fell onto the straw at his feet. He rotated the quill a quarter turn and scraped again and again until the entire base was clean and smooth, the hollow interior visible as a small dark circle at the end. The scraping made a faint sound, a whisper of metal on keratin, so quiet it could only be heard if one was listening for it. The farmer's hands moved with the economy of long practice, each movement small and precise, the knife held as naturally as a spoon at supper. He worked his way around the full circumference of the quill base, removing every last fleck of dried material, leaving the shaft perfectly clean from the tip of the calamus to the place where the vein began. When he was satisfied, he held the quill up to the light again and looked through the hollow center, checking that the channel was clear, for a blocked quill would not hold ink properly and was of little use to a scribe. The interior of the quill needed attention as well, for inside the hollow shaft there remained a thin membrane, a dried remnant of the blood vessel that had fed the growing feather. This membrane was delicate and almost transparent, like the skin inside an eggshell, and it had to be removed before the quill could be used for writing. The farmer took a thin piece of wire from the small collection of tools on the tray, a length of stiff brass no thicker than a darning needle, and inserted it gently into the open end of the quill. He pushed it slowly up the hollow shaft, feeling the slight resistance as it encountered the membrane, and then with a careful twisting motion he loosened the dried material and drew it out, a tiny ghost of tissue that clung to the wire and came away cleanly. He repeated this for each quill in turn, scraping the outside and cleaning the inside, laying each finished feather back on the tray in its proper row. The work was repetitive but not tedious, each quill presenting its own small variations. One had a slightly thicker shaft that required a firmer scrape, another had a faint curve near the base that made the wire insertion more delicate, a third had a small nick in the vein that the farmer noted but did not discard, for it could still be used by a scribe who preferred a shorter quill, or by someone who would cut the feather down for a different purpose. The pile of discarded tissue and membrane fragments grew on the straw between his feet, so small and light it was barely visible. A few pale specks that would be swept away at the end of the day and scattered on the midden where they would break down into the soil over the winter. Nothing was wasted on the farm, not even these tiny remnants, for they would feed the earth that would feed the grass that would feed the geese in the years to come. When all 20 quills had been scraped and cleaned, the farmer laid the knife aside and lifted the tray onto his lap, looking at the feathers as a group. They were now ready for sorting, and he began to arrange them by length and thickness into 3 distinct bundles. The longest and thickest quills, those from the outermost part of the wing, would make the finest writing instruments, suitable for the most demanding work, the copying of manuscripts, the drafting of legal documents, the writing of letters that would be read by important eyes. These he gathered into a pile on the left side of the tray, the 10 best quills from across both wings, their shafts strong and straight, and their veins broad and perfect. The middle grade of quills, slightly shorter and thinner, but still good, would serve for everyday writing, household accounts, school exercises, the ordinary correspondence of merchants and farmers. These he placed in a pile at the center of the tray, 6 quills of medium quality that were perfectly serviceable but not exceptional. The remaining 4 quills, the shortest and softest from the innermost wing, he placed on the right side. These would be sold more cheaply or kept on the farm for his own occasional use when he needed to mark a tally stick or scratch a note on a scrap of paper. The sorting was based on knowledge that had been passed down through his family, the accumulated wisdom of generations of goose farmers who had supplied quills to the scriptoria of monasteries and the desks of town clerks. He knew that a scribe would examine each quill carefully before buying, testing the shaft for straightness and strength, checking the vein for damage, running a thumb along the calamus to feel for any hidden weakness. The farmer's reputation rested on the quality of his quills, and though no scribe would ever know his name or visit his farmyard, he took care to sort them honestly, matching price to quality with a fairness that was simply part of his nature. With the quills sorted, he reached for the ball of hemp twine that sat among the tools on the bench, a small tight sphere of twisted fibers that had been spun by his wife during the long winter evenings. He pulled a length of twine from the ball and cut it with a knife, then divided the cut piece into 3 shorter lengths. The best quills he gathered into a bundle of 10, aligning their shafts so the bases were even and the veins lay flat against each other, and he wound the twine around the bundle just above the calamus, tying it with a simple knot that could be easily undone when the scribe was ready to use them. The twine was tight enough to hold the quills together, but not so tight that it would mark the shafts, and he tested the bundle by lifting it and giving it a gentle shake, watching to see that no feather slipped out of place. The medium quills he tied in a bundle of 6, the lesser quills in a bundle of 4, each bundle wrapped with the same careful tension and the same square knot that sat flat against the shafts. The 3 bundles lay on the tray like small sheaves of pale grain, their veins fanning out at the top and their tied bases forming compact handles at the bottom. They looked orderly and purposeful, ready for storage and eventual sale, the work of the morning made visible in these neat little packages. The farmer's wife came to the doorway of the farmhouse and called softly across the yard that the midday bread would be ready soon, her voice carrying clearly through the still air without being loud. The farmer looked up and raised one hand in acknowledgement, a small gesture that said he had heard and would come when the time was right. Then he returned his attention to the bundles on the tray, checking the knots one last time, making sure everything was secure and properly aligned. He lifted the bundles and carried them into the barn, where a shelf high on the north wall kept things safe from the mice that sometimes found their way into the grain stores. The shelf was a simple plank of rough pine supported on 2 iron brackets, and on it lay a few other bundles of quills from previous plucking sessions, their twine still tight and their feathers still clean, despite the weeks they had spent in the darkness. The farmer placed the new bundles beside the old ones, aligning them so they formed a continuous row, and then he took a scrap of oiled cloth that hung from a nail and draped it over the quills to protect them from dust. The barn was dim and warm, the cows still in their stalls, making the small sounds of contented animals, and the air smelled of hay and leather, and the faint mustiness of the earth floor. The farmer stood for a moment in the quiet space, letting his eyes adjust to the lower light, feeling the solidity of the barn around him. The walls were thick and the roof was sound, and the animals within were fed and calm, and the quills on the shelf represented the careful work of his hands, work that would travel far beyond this valley, to places he would never see, carried by traders along the roads to Prague and Vienna, and perhaps even further, to the desks of scholars and clerks and letter-writers, whose words would flow through these very feathers. He turned and walked back out into the sunlight, blinking at the brightness after the dimness of the barn. The tray on the stool was now empty except for the knife and the wire and the few small tools, and he gathered these up and carried them back to the workbench inside the barn, putting each one in its proper place. The knife went onto its shelf, the wire into a small clay pot that held other slender items, the whetstone back into its corner. The workspace under the overhang was gradually being dismantled, the tools returning to their homes, the evidence of the morning's labor being put away piece by piece. Only the basket of down remained beside the bench, its contents still needing to be washed and dried, and the farmer looked at it as he passed, noting how the down had settled in the basket, the mound now slightly lower than it had been at the end of the plucking, the fibers compressing under their own negligible weight. That would be the next task after the midday rest, the washing and drying and final preparation of the soft harvest that would fill pillows and bring warmth to sleepers through the cold Bohemian winter. For now, though, the farmer washed his hands one more time in the bucket of water, rubbing away the last invisible traces of quill dust and feather fragments, and dried them on the rag. He straightened his apron, ran a hand through his hair, and began the slow walk toward the farmhouse where the smell of fresh bread was now strong and inviting, a promise of rest and nourishment before the afternoon's work began. The farmer returned to the bench under the overhang after his midday meal, the taste of bread and cheese still faint on his tongue, and the warmth of the kitchen fire still lingering in his clothes. The sun had passed its highest point, and was now beginning its slow descent toward the western hills. Though there were still many hours of good light left, the golden color of the afternoon just starting to deepen toward amber. The shadows under the barn roof had grown longer and softer at their edges, and the air had warmed to a pleasant coolness that was neither the chill of morning nor the thin heat of summer, but something in between, a temperature that asked nothing of the body except to be present. The basket of down sat where he had left it. The mound of grey-white fluff settled slightly during the pause, its surface gently undulating with each small movement of the air. He lifted the basket by its two handles, feeling the weight of the down, which was almost nothing, the basket feeling nearly as light as it had when empty, and he carried it across the yard to the area beside the well where the washing would be done. This was a flat patch of packed earth that sloped very slightly away from the well so that spilled water would drain toward the vegetable garden rather than pooling around the stones. He set the basket down and went to the barn to fetch the wide, shallow tub that was used for washing fleeces and feathers and other light things that needed gentle handling. The tub was made of pine boards held together with wooden pegs and sealed along the seams with beeswax and resin. It was broad enough that a person could stretch both arms across it, and shallow enough that water could be poured in without making it too heavy to move. He carried it out into the sunlight, tilting it to pass through the barn doorway, and set it on the flat ground beside the well. Then he returned to the barn for two wooden hurdles, the same kind that formed the goose pen, and set them up on their sides to form a low platform, a drying frame where the clean down would later be spread. The farmer's wife had washed a stack of coarse linen cloths the day before, and these were now dry and folded in a basket by the farmhouse door. He brought 3 of them to the washing area and spread them over the hurdles, smoothing out the wrinkles with his palm so they lay flat, their surface slightly rough and perfectly clean, ready to receive the wet down. The cloths were a pale oatmeal color, and they smelled of the lye soap his wife made from wood ash and tallow, a clean, sharp scent that would not transfer to the feathers. Now he drew water from the well, sending the bucket down and bringing it up hand over hand, the rope creaking softly against the windlass, the water cold and clear and dark as it rose into the sunlight. He poured the water into the shallow tub, bucket after bucket, until the tub was half full and the surface of the water was smooth and still, reflecting the pale blue of the sky and the faint wisps of high cloud that had appeared during the morning. The water was cold, cold enough to make his fingers tingle when he tested it, which was right, because cold water would help the down keep its loft and prevent any of the natural oils from breaking down. He knelt beside the tub and lifted the basket of down onto the ground next to him, where he could reach it easily. The down in the basket looked different now that it was about to be washed, less like a harvest and more like a cloud that had settled temporarily to earth, its surface shifting and quivering with every breath of air. He scooped up a handful of the down, feeling its familiar lightness, the fibers barely registering against his palm, and he lowered his hand slowly into the water, letting the down float on the surface rather than pushing it under. The down spread across the water like a living thing, the individual tufts separating and drifting, their fibers reaching outward in all directions until the surface of the water was covered with a thin layer of pale fluff. It was beautiful in its way, the grey and white fibers floating on the dark water, catching the sunlight on their finest tips, moving with the slow currents created by the farmer's submerged hand. He added more down, handful by handful, scattering it across the surface of the water in a thin, even layer, and soon the tub was covered with a floating blanket of grey-white that hid the darkness beneath. The washing itself was a gentle process, not scrubbing or agitating, but simply moving the down through the water so that the dust and the tiny fragments of dry skin would be loosened and left behind. The farmer used both hands, his fingers spread wide, and he moved them slowly through the floating mass, lifting and separating the tufts, letting the water flow through the individual fibers. The The down resisted slightly, the way any light thing resists being submerged, but as the fibers gradually absorbed the water, they began to sink just a little, their buoyancy giving way to a soft willingness to be moved. The water did not become dirty in any visible way, for the dust that had clung to the down was too fine to cloud the water, consisting mostly of tiny scales of dry skin and the microscopic particles that gathered on any living thing over time. But the farmer could feel the slight grittiness wash away under his fingers, the fibers becoming cleaner and more slippery as the water carried off the last traces of the bird's body. He worked slowly and methodically, his hands moving in slow circles, lifting and separating and letting the down drift back to the surface, repeating the motion until every handful of down in the basket had been washed. When he was satisfied that the down was clean, he sat back on his heels and wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist, leaving a faint smear of water on his skin. His hands were cold from the water, the fingers reddened and slightly stiff, and he rubbed them together briskly to bring back the warmth before continuing. The tub was now filled with a floating mass of clean wet down, the fibers clinging together in the water, their color a darker gray than before because they were saturated. The next step was to lift the down from the water and spread it on the linen cloths to dry. This was the most delicate part of the process, for wet down was fragile, the fibers heavy with water and easily clumped together if handled too roughly. The farmer used a small wooden sieve with a handle, a tool that had been made specifically for this task, its mesh woven of fine horsehair stretched across a willow hoop. He slipped the sieve gently under a portion of the floating down and lifted it from the water, letting the excess drip back into the tub through the mesh. The down that remained in the sieve was a dark sodden mat, barely resembling the light fluff it had been, and he carried it carefully to the drying frames. On the hurdles the linen cloths waited, their surface rough enough to hold the down in place, but smooth enough to let the water drain away. The farmer turned the sieve over and let the wet down fall onto the cloth, where it landed with a soft wet sound, a faint slap of dampness. He spread it gently with his fingertips, pulling apart the clumps and distributing the fibers in a thin, even layer, the down stretching and separating under his touch. The water began to drain immediately through the linen, darkening the cloth beneath each patch of down, and small drops fell from the underside of the hurdles onto the packed earth, making tiny dark spots that would evaporate within the hour. He returned to the tub with the sieve, scooping up more of the clean wet down and carrying it to the frames, spreading it beside the first layer, and then again and again until the tub was empty and all the down lay on the 3 linen-covered hurdles in thin, even sheets. The down was now a pale grey color, darker than it had been when dry, but already beginning to lighten at the edges as the water drained away. It looked like a thin layer of early snow on the brown cloth, patchy and uneven. But the sun was warm on it, and the air was dry, and the farmer knew that within a few hours it would be as light and fluffy as it had been on the bird. He emptied the tub, tipping it carefully so the water ran away down the slight slope toward the vegetable garden, where it would water the winter cabbages that stood in neat rows near the fence. The tub he rinsed with a fresh bucket of well water, sloshing it around to remove any stray fibers that had stuck to the sides, and then he set it on its edge against the barn wall to dry in the sun. The sieve he rinsed as well, holding it under the well spout and letting the water pour through the mesh until it ran clear, and then he hung it on a nail by the barn door where it always hung. The farmer's wife came out again while he was tidying the washing area, carrying a basket of mending that she settled on the doorstep with the grey cat immediately curling up beside her. She looked over at the drying frames where the down was spread in its thin sheets, and she nodded slightly to herself, a small gesture of approval at the work well done. She did not speak, for there was no need, and the farmer did not speak either. The two of them sharing the quiet companionship of people who had worked beside each other for many years and had long since exhausted the need for words. The farmer pulled the wooden bench from under the overhang and carried it to a spot near the drying frames, setting it in a patch of sun where he could sit and watch the down dry. This watching was not idleness, but a necessary part of the work, for the down needed to be turned occasionally so that it dried evenly, and it needed to be guarded from the hens who might decide to scratch through it, or from any sudden gust of wind that might scatter it across the yard. So he sat on the bench with his hands resting on his knees and his face turned toward the sun, his eyes half closed against the brightness, his breathing slow and even. The down dried slowly in the gentle autumn sun. its color lightening by almost imperceptible degrees, the gray giving way to a softer gray, and then to the pale silvery white that was its true shade. The fibers began to lift as they dried, the individual barbs separating from each other and reaching upward, and the thin wet mats gradually transformed into light fluffy sheets that stirred with every breath of air. The farmer rose occasionally from the bench to turn the down, using his fingertips to gently lift and shift the fibers, ensuring that the underside was exposed to the sun and the air. The down made a soft ruffling sound as he moved it, the sound of clean, dry fluff sliding against itself, and it released the last of the cool well water as a faint dampness on his fingers. The sun continued its slow journey westward, the light deepening from pale gold to a richer amber, the shadows stretching longer across the yard, and the down on the frames grew lighter and more buoyant with each passing minute. The farmer sat and watched and occasionally stirred, and the afternoon passed in the same quiet rhythm that had governed the entire day, a rhythm as old as the hills and as steady as the turning of the sky. The down lay drying on the linen cloths, its color now a pale silvery white that shifted gently in the lightest stirring of the air, and the farmer rose from his bench with the slow deliberation of a man who had been sitting in the sun and was in no hurry to leave its warmth. He stretched his arms once, feeling the pull in his shoulders from the morning's work, and then he walked across the yard toward the goose pen, his shadow now falling to his right, shortened by the high angle of the afternoon sun. The yard was quiet except for the distant cawing of a crow somewhere beyond the fields, and the soft clucking of the hens who had found a patch of dry earth near the woodshed where they were taking their own midday rest, squatting with their feathers fluffed out and their eyes half closed. The goose pen was calm when he reached it. The 12 birds settled in their afternoon pattern of rest and gentle movement. Some stood near the water trough, dipping their bills and lifting them to let the water run down their throats, while others had lowered themselves onto the deep straw with their legs folded beneath them and their necks curved back in the graceful resting posture of waterfowl. The gander he had plucked was among the resting birds, its eyes closed and its bill tucked into the feathers of its back, looking no different from the others except for the slightly thinner plumage that only the farmer's experienced eye could detect. The bird was comfortable and content, its breathing slow and even, its body already beginning the long process of growing new down to replace what had been taken. The farmer opened the gate and stepped inside the pen, moving quietly among the resting birds, and he crouched down beside the gander with a soft grunt as his knees bent. He placed his hand on the bird's back, feeling the warmth through the remaining feathers, and the gander opened its eyes and lifted its head, regarding him with that same calm intelligence it had shown all morning. The farmer ran his palm along the bird's body, checking the skin beneath the feathers for any sign of irritation or discomfort. But the skin was smooth and warm and healthy, the follicles already closing where the feathers had been removed. The gander made a low sound, a soft gurgle, deep in its throat, and then it tucked its head back into its feathers and closed its eyes again, its trust complete and unshaken. The farmer remained crouched for a moment longer, looking at the flock with the quiet satisfaction of a shepherd watching over his charges. The geese were in good condition, their eyes bright and their plumage glossy, their feet clean and free of sores, their weight solid and healthy. They had enough straw, enough shelter from the coming winter. The hurdles of the pen were sound, the gate secure, the trough clean. Everything was as it should be, and the farmer felt the deep contented tiredness of work, well done, settle into his bones like warmth from a fire. He rose and left the pen, closing the gate carefully and making sure the cord loop was secure over the post. Then he walked to the well and drew up a fresh bucket of water, the rope creaking in its familiar rhythm, the bucket emerging into the daylight with water streaming from its sides. He poured some into the trough for the geese, watching the clean water swirl and settle, and then he poured the rest over his hands, rubbing them together to wash away the last traces of down and quill dust, and the faint animal smell of the goose. The water was cold and clean, and he splashed some onto his face, feeling the coolness tighten his skin and refresh his eyes, washing away the slight drowsiness that had come from sitting in the sun. He dried his face and hands in the cloth that hung from his belt, then walked to the farmhouse where his wife had set out the midday meal on the doorstep, a simple spread, laid on a clean linen cloth spread over the flat stone. She had gone back inside to tend the fire and the bread, and the doorstep was now occupied only by the grey cat and by the food she had left for him. He sat down on the worn stone, his back against the doorframe, his legs stretched out before him, and he looked at the plate she had prepared with the same careful attention he had given to every part of the day. The plate held a thick slice of the bread she had baked that morning, its crust dark and crackled, and its interior a pale brown, the surface still slightly warm from the oven, and dotted with small holes where the yeast had worked. Beside it was a wedge of white cheese, crumbly at the edges and smooth at the center, its flavor mild and clean. There was also a small clay cup of weak beer, the color of pale amber, its surface still and faintly bubbling at the rim where the yeast was still alive. A few sprigs of fresh parsley from the herb garden lay on the side of the plate, their leaves dark green and glistening with the last of the morning dew. The farmer picked up the bread and broke it in his hands, feeling the crust resist and then yield, the soft interior tearing cleanly. He took a bite and chewed slowly, his jaw working in a steady rhythm, the flavor of the bread filling his mouth. It tasted of the rye his wife had ground 2 days ago in the stone quern, of the sourdough starter she kept alive in a crock near the hearth, of the beechwood smoke from the oven, and the faint saltiness of the butter she had worked into the dough. Each bite was chewed many times, not from any conscious effort, but simply from the slow pace at which he ate, the same unhurried pace that governed every part of his day. The cheese he ate in small crumbly pieces, pressing it against the bread so the two flavors mingled, the sharpness of the cheese cutting through the dense earthiness of the rye. The beer he drank in small sips, the clay cup cool against his lips, the liquid slightly sour and very faintly sweet, the taste of fermented barley and the clean water of the well. It was not a strong drink, but a nourishing one, the kind of beer that farm workers had drunk for centuries as a safer alternative to water. Its alcohol so low, it merely refreshed without dulling the senses. The grey cat watched him eat with half-closed eyes, its tail wrapped around its paws, its whiskers twitching occasionally at the scent of cheese. After a while it rose and stretched, its back arching high and its claws extending briefly against the stone, and then it walked over to the farmer and curled against his thigh, its body warm and soft against his leg. He broke off a small piece of cheese and offered it to the cat, which sniffed it delicately and then ate it with a few quick bites, its rough tongue passing over its whiskers afterward to catch any remaining crumbs. The two of them sat in companionable silence, man and cat, sharing the warmth of the doorstep and the quiet of the afternoon. The farmer ate the parsley last, chewing the fresh green leaves slowly, their bright, sharp flavor clearing his palate and leaving his mouth feeling clean. He drank the last of the beer, set the cup down on the stone, and wiped his hands on the cloth at his belt. The plate was now empty, except for a few crumbs that the cat would later find, and the farmer sat for a while without moving, his hands resting on his thighs, his eyes looking out across the yard toward the drying frames where the down was slowly lightening in the sun. The farmyard in the early afternoon was a place of profound stillness. The hens had stopped their scratching and were now roosting in the shade of the woodshed, their heads tucked under their wings. The geese were quiet in their pen, the only movement among them, the occasional ripple of a feather as a bird shifted its weight. Even the small birds in the apple tree had fallen silent, dozing through the warmest part of the day. The smoke from the chimney had thinned to a barely visible wisp, and the sun hung in the sky like a slow golden wheel, its progress almost imperceptible. The farmer's thoughts, if they could be called thoughts, were as still as the yard. He did not plan the afternoon's work, or review the morning's tasks, or worry about the coming winter, or remember the past spring. His mind was simply present, resting in the moment the way his body rested on the doorstep, taking in the world through his senses without naming or judging any of it. The warmth of the sun on his face, the coolness of the stone beneath him, the soft weight of the cat against his leg, the faint smell of the drying down, and the clean earth and the distant scent of wood smoke. These things existed, and he existed among them, and that was enough. After a time he rose from the doorstep, lifting the cat gently from his leg and setting it on the warm stone, where it immediately curled back into a tight circle. He picked up the plate and cup and carried them inside the farmhouse, where his wife was sitting at the table with her mending, the needle moving in and out of a torn sleeve with the same steady rhythm he had used to pluck the down. He set the dishes on the wooden sideboard and poured himself a cup of water from the pail, drinking it standing by the hearth where the fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers. The house was warm and dim, and smelled of bread and herbs and the faint sweetness of the dried flowers she kept in a jar on the mantel. He did not linger inside, for the afternoon was still fine and the down needed watching, but he paused for a moment with his hand on the doorframe, looking at his wife, bent over her sewing in the firelight. She looked up and met his eyes, and something passed between them that was not a word and not a gesture, but simply the quiet recognition of two people who had shared many days like this one, working side by side in the rhythm of the seasons. Then he stepped back out into the sunlight, and the door closed softly behind him. The farmer walked to the drying frames and stood looking at the down, which had now dried almost completely. The fibers were light and fluffy again, their color a clean silvery white, and they stirred gently at his approach, the merest disturbance of the air sending small ripples across the surface of the thin sheets. He bent and lifted a handful, testing its dryness between his fingers, feeling the familiar lightness and the faint springiness that meant it was ready. The down floated in his palm as if it weighed nothing, and when he released it back onto the cloth, it settled with a softness that was almost silence. There was still an hour or two of good light left before the sun dropped behind the western hills and the chill of evening settled over the farm. The down was dry and ready for bundling. The quills were clean and stored in the barn. The goose was resting comfortably among its flock, and the farmer felt the quiet satisfaction of a day that had unfolded exactly as it should, without haste or interruption or any event more dramatic than the slow turning of the sky. He sat down on the bench in the patch of sun beside the drying frames, his hands resting on his knees, his face turned toward the light, and he let the afternoon pass in the same stillness that had filled the entire day, a deep and peaceful quiet that asked nothing of him except to be present and to rest. The afternoon light began to soften as the sun sank lower over the western hills, its color deepening from pale gold to a rich amber that seemed to thicken the air itself, turning the farmyard into a place of long shadows and warm glowing surfaces. The down on the drying frames was fully dry now, its fibers light and buoyant, stirring with every faint movement of the air like a living thing breathing in its sleep. The farmer rose from the bench where he had been sitting, his body rested and his mind quiet, and he walked to the frames to begin the final task of the day, gathering the clean down and putting it away for the winter. He lifted the first linen cloth by its four corners, cradling it like a sling, and carried it to the bench under the overhang where the wicker basket waited. The down on the cloth had dried in a thin even sheet, and it held together just enough to be moved without scattering, the individual fibers clinging to each other with the faint static of their own lightness. He set the cloth on the bench and carefully folded it inward from the edges, guiding the down toward the center in a slow, deliberate motion, the way one might gather a handful of fresh snow without compressing it. The down shifted and settled, its silvery whiteness catching the amber light, and when he had gathered it into a loose pile, he lifted the cloth and tipped the down into the basket. The basket was familiar under his hands, its woven willow sides now warmed by the afternoon sun, and he repeated the process with the second cloth and then the third, carrying each one to the bench and folding the dry down into the basket with the same patient care. The down from the third frame was the last and smallest batch, the fibers slightly finer than the rest, and when it joined the pile in the basket, the whole mass rose above the rim in a soft mound that quivered gently with the movement of the air. The farmer pressed it down lightly with his palm, feeling the down compress and then slowly expand again, its springy resistance a sign that it was properly dry and would keep its loft through the long months ahead. He took a moment to brush the stray fibers from the linen cloths, shaking them gently over the basket so that every last wisp of down was saved. Then he folded the cloths and set them aside on the bench, where they would later be taken inside and washed again, made ready for the next plucking session or for some other use that required clean, coarse linen. Nothing on the farm was wasted or left untended. Every tool and cloth and scrap had its place and its purpose, a quiet order that had grown over the years like the moss on the well stones. Now he brought out the storage sacks from the barn, 3 bags made of tightly woven hemp that had been sewn by his wife on winter evenings, their seams double-stitched and their drawstrings of leather cord. The sacks were pale brown and smelled faintly of the hayloft where they were stored, and they were large enough to hold a generous amount of down without packing it too tightly. He opened the first sack and set it on the ground beside the bench, its mouth held wide by a wooden hoop that had been stitched into the hem, a clever device that made filling easier. The farmer scooped the down from the basket with both hands, lifting it in large, fluffy handfuls that seemed to weigh nothing at all, and he placed it carefully into the sack. The down settled softly, filling the bottom of the sack and then rising slowly as he added more, its surface uneven and shifting like the surface of a cloud seen from above. He worked steadily, his hands moving in the same calm rhythm they had used for the plucking and the washing, and the sack gradually filled until the down reached the wooden hoop at the top. He drew the leather cord tight, the drawstring sliding smoothly through its channel, and tied it with a simple knot that would hold but could be easily undone when the time came to use the down. The second sack he filled in the same way, and then the third, until the basket was empty and all the down was secured in the 3 hemp bags, each one plump and soft and almost weightless, despite its volume. The sacks sat on the ground beside the bench like 3 pale pillows, their sides bulging gently, and the farmer looked at them with the quiet satisfaction of a harvest completed. This down would fill the pillows and coverlets that his wife would sew during the winter, or it would be taken to the village market and traded for salt or iron or cloth, or it would be kept against a future need that could not yet be foreseen. Whatever its destination, it was ready, clean and dry and properly stored. He carried the sacks into the barn one at a time, lifting each one carefully despite its lightness, and he climbed the ladder of split ash poles to the hayloft above the animal stalls. The loft was dim and warm, filled with the smell of dried grass and the faint dust of old hay, and the roof was close overhead, the underside of the thatch visible between the rafters. A row of similar hemp sacks lay along one wall, some filled with down from earlier pluckings and others filled with fleece from the spring shearing, all of them waiting for the season when they would be needed. The farmer placed the 3 new sacks beside the others, arranging them neatly so they formed an orderly row, their round shapes fitting together like eggs in a nest. The loft was a place of deep quiet, insulated by the hay and the thatch, and the sounds of the yard below came up only faintly. The distant cluck of a hen, the creak of the barn door in the light breeze, the soft murmur of the farmer's wife calling to the cat. The farmer stood for a moment in the dimness, his hand resting on one of the soft sacks, and he felt the presence of the stored harvests around him, the hay that would feed the animals through the winter, the fleece that would be spun and woven, the down that would bring warmth to sleepers in the coldest months. It was a feeling of security that had no words, the knowledge that the farm had provided, and would continue to provide, that the work of the seasons had been done and done well. He climbed down from the loft and returned to the barn's main floor where the cows were still in their stalls, their large dark eyes following him with mild curiosity as he passed. He checked their water and their hay, both of which were sufficient, and he ran his hand along the flank of the nearest cow, feeling the warmth of her hide and the slow rhythm of her breathing. Then he went to the shelf where the quills were stored and lifted the oiled cloth that covered them, checking that the bundles were still secure and the feathers still clean. The 3 bundles lay where he had placed them earlier in the day, their twine tight and their veins smooth, and he let the cloth fall back over them and turned away. Outside the barn, the afternoon was drawing toward evening. The sun had dropped behind the western hills, and the sky above them was a wash of pale gold and soft pink, the colors blending into each other like water on a painter's board. The shadows had stretched across the entire yard, reaching from the barn to the farmhouse, and the air had taken on the slight chill that came with the end of the day. The farmer walked to the bench under the overhang and began to put away the last of the tools, working in the same slow, methodical way he had used all day. The basket he carried back to the barn and set upside down on a shelf where it would stay clean and dry. The bench he lifted and returned to its place against the inner wall, the legs fitting into the same depressions in the earth floor that they had occupied for years. The folding stool he collapsed and hung from its peg near the door, and the bucket he emptied of the last of the washing water, throwing it in a wide arc over the vegetable garden where it scattered into silver drops, before vanishing into the dark soil. The bucket he turned upside down beside the well so it would drain and dry. He swept the area under the overhang with a birch broom that stood near the barn door, its twigs worn into a slant from long use. The sweepings were a mixture of straw, a few stray down fibers, the tiny curled remnants of the quill cleaning, and the ordinary dust of the day. He gathered them into a small pile and scooped them into a wooden bucket that would be taken to the midden later, adding their small contribution to the compost that would enrich the fields in the years to come. The packed earth under the overhang was now clean and bare, showing no sign of the morning's work except a slight darkening where the water bucket had stood. The farmer stood the broom back in its place and looked around the yard with the careful eye of someone closing up for the night. The hens had already gone into their coop, their soft clucking barely audible through the wooden walls. The cat had moved from the doorstep and was now somewhere in the barn, probably curled in the hayloft where the mice were. The farmhouse chimney still sent up a thin line of smoke, and a warm yellow light had appeared in the small window where his wife had lit the tallow lamp. The goose pen was quiet. The birds settled for the night in their cluster of white and grey, their heads already tucked under their wings. He walked to the goose pen one last time, his footsteps quiet on the packed earth, and he stood by the gate looking at the flock. The gander he had plucked was among them, indistinguishable from the others now in the fading light, and all of them were calm, their breathing slow and even, their bodies warm under their remaining feathers. The farmer checked the gate cord, found it secure, and then turned toward the farmhouse, his day's work complete. The first star had appeared above the barn ridge, a single point of light in the deepening blue of the eastern sky. The air was still and cool, carrying the smell of wood smoke and the faint sweetness of the last autumn grasses, and the world seemed to hold its breath in the pause between day and night. The farmer stopped for a moment in the center of the yard, his hands at his sides, his face lifted to the sky, and he let the quiet of the evening settle over him like the down he had gathered, soft and warm and weightless. Then he walked to the farmhouse door, where the yellow lamplight spilled out through the small window, and the smell of the evening meal was beginning to drift from the chimney. He paused on the doorstep and looked back one more time at the yard, at the dark shape of the barn against the sky, at the pale glimmer of the goose pen in the dusk, at the silhouette of the apple tree and the well and the low stone walls that marked the boundaries of his world. Everything was in its place, everything was at peace, and the night was coming on in its slow and certain way. He opened the door and went inside, and the farmyard was left to the darkness, and the stars and the small sounds of the night creatures beginning their own quiet work. The day of plucking was over, the feathers were stored, the goose was resting with its flock, and the farm slept under the autumn sky in the year 1600, as it had slept for many years before, and would sleep for many years to come.